Chapter 91. Samar 1. The fifth-ranked Demon King of Carnage had the Annihilation Hammer Jigalath. The fourth-ranked Demon King of Cruelty had the Demon Spear Luentos. However, the third-ranked Demon King of Fury didn't possess anything like a special weapon. In place of that, the Demon King of Fury commanded a great army. In his army, the proportion of heterogeneous races was unusually high. The giants led by Kamash served as the vanguard of Fury's army, and alongside them fought beastfolk and elves. Races that were created from the corruption of human beings, like the vampires and the lycanthropes, were also recruited into Fury's army. The four most powerful warriors in his entire army were known as Fury's four heavenly kings. The chief of the giants, the Earthshaker Kamash. The vampire lord, the bloodshedder Sane. The lunatic of the beastfolk, the depraved Oberon. The dark elf princess, the Rakshasa Iris. 300 years ago, Hamel and Vermouth had worked together to slay Kamash. After that, they killed the Demon Kings of Carnage and Cruelty. As they were making their way to the Demon King of Fury's castle, bolstered by this momentum, they were ambushed by the vampires led by the bloodshedder Sane. During that battle they managed to kill Sane. Although he was a vampire and therefore extremely difficult to kill, Anissa's divine power and Vermouth's holy sword were enough to end him, and Sane's body was burned to ashes. In the Demon King of Fury's castle, they were attacked by the beastfolk and the dark elves, led by Oberon and Iris. They weren't able to kill these two like they did Sane, as the two of them managed to retreat to Fury's position and readied their final defenses. It was a truly terrible fight. Oberon was strong and so too was Iris. Needless to say, the Demon King of Fury was also extremely powerful. However, in the end they were defeated. While Vermouth was facing the Demon King of Fury, Molan faced Oberon. Hamel's opponent was Iris. "Father." He could still hear that desperate cry of hers ringing in his ears. When Fury finally fell, the blood-stained Iris ran over to Fury while letting out that scream. Hamel had no intention of letting Iris go freely. The dark elf was strong and a difficult opponent to deal with. Even if Iris did manage to break away from him, it wouldn't have changed Fury's death. But regardless of this fact, Hamel had planned to put an end to Iris. But to put it bluntly, he failed. For some reason, instead of using the last of his power to make a counterattack or revive himself, the dying Fury used it to help Oberon and Iris escape. No one there had expected that the Demon King of Fury would do something like that. Sienna's magic wasn't able to stop Oberon and Iris's escape in time. Even a guy like Vermouth had shown a momentary look of bewilderment at Fury's actions. "I'll kill you. I'll kill all of you, Father." As space was ripped open to form a door, Fury's dark magic engulfed Iris and Oberon. Iris was still trying to attack them even as she wept convulsively, but Oberon, who had lost an arm, kept a tight hold on Iris. "Hamel, it's because you blocked me." "Fuck, stop with that bullshit. So what if I blocked you?" Hamel had mocked Iris's resentment. Even in her current situation, with Iris having barely managed to escape after being rendered close to death, instead of Vermouth who had put a sword through Fury's chest, it was he, Hamel, that Iris resented more. It was just ridiculous. In any case, that was how the Demon King of Fury died. Iris and Oberon escaped, and the rest of the dark elves and beastfolk all scattered. Now 300 years had passed. The vampires who had lost their lord, and the lycanthropes all came under the control of Noir Giabella, queen of the night demons. The remaining giants had united amongst themselves to form a tribe in the rugged backwoods of Helmuth. Oberon had sworn himself to the Demon King of Destruction, but about 150 years ago his own son had ripped out his throat and killed him. As for Iris, "We never met again after that," Eugene recalled. Even though she had been glaring at him with poison in her eyes and spitting out dire curses right up until the end, he had never encountered Iris again. "I should have killed her back then," Eugene regretted. Just like elves, dark elves lived for a long time. Their lifespans went well over 1,000 years. In the first place, elves and dark elves weren't actually separate races. When an elf was corrupted by a demon king and accepted their demonic power, they became a dark elf. "Calling Fury her father because of that is just nonsense," Eugene scoffed. Even now, after having been reincarnated, he still couldn't really understand what Iris had been thinking at that moment. The Demon King of Fury had made all the four heavenly kings believe that they were his children. Even Kamash, who was as huge as a mountain, believed that he was Fury's eldest son. Right before Kamash had perished, he had called out Father one last time. It was a thoroughly unamusing way of playing house. By tying them together through the relationship of a family, even though they didn't share any blood, Eugene felt that Fury was only using these bonds as a tool to evoke a sense of unity and loyalty. However, at the moment of his death, Fury had allowed his daughter Iris and his son Oberon to escape. Why had he done that? If he had that much energy left, then he could have made himself into a suicide bomb. Though he wouldn't have been able to kill Vermouth even with that, wasn't that a more fitting last act for a demon king? It's fortunate that Oberon has passed away, but the son who was able to rip his throat out must be quite the formidable madman. The beast folk were also divided internally between several different races. 300 years ago, Oberon was crazy enough that he could still be called the lunatic, even when compared to the rest of the beast folk. But it seemed that the son he had managed to sire was just as crazy as his father. Eugene couldn't help but be wary of Oberon's son and Iris. They had arrived at the Samar rainforest. This place was, in a certain sense, even more dangerous than Helmuth. Although it was not as infested with demon folk as Helmuth, and there also was no one who even came close to the level of a demon king, Samar was still full of low-grade trash. Unlike in other countries, identity cards didn't see any use here. Heinous criminals who shouldn't be allowed in the same country, let alone the same city, and those who should have been imprisoned until they rotted or just flat-out executed, whether they had managed to escape or were never caught in the first place, all these people fled to Helmuth or Samar. Of course, even Samar had laws. However, since these laws covered much less than the laws passed in ordinary countries, Samar was still called a lawless zone. The natives of this place were uncivilized and the laws differed from tribe to tribe. In any ordinary country, murder was a crime, but in Samar that wasn't necessarily the case. Murder could be forgiven for even the slightest of reasons, and some of the barbaric tribes might even consider murder without cause to be a valiant act. To think that people would still try to do missionary work in Samar. It must be quite a popular mode of suicide, a brown-skinned man observed as he scanned Eugene and Christina with narrow eyes. Just like Christina has said, there had been no problems with using the counterfeit identity cards to pass through Kiel's southern border. The problems came after that. Not only was Samar even larger than the Kiel Empire's entire territory, there weren't any warp gates opened for usage. Although it looked like a few had been installed, there were only a handful of people with permission to use the warp gates in Samar. No matter how much money that they offered, foreign nobles were not allowed to use Samar's warp gates. In other words, after they crossed the border, they had no choice but to continue riding in a carriage or on horseback. After having traveled like this for a few days, they arrived at the trade city that was located closest to the border. Although it was called a trade city, it couldn't compare to any of the cities found in Kiel or Arath. There were no buildings taller than a few floors and the roads were filthy. Our reasons for coming here shouldn't matter to you, no? Christina said with a soft smile as she showed him her identity card. At this, the man let out a hearty laugh and flipped Christina's identity card over to inspect it. Let's see here, so you're a D-class adventurer. But so what? Isn't this affiliated with the Adventurers Guild? I would like to receive the regular service for someone of my class, Christina hesitantly requested. Haha. Miss Nunn, are you pretending to be naive or are you just really that naive? This place might be close to Kiel, but it's still a town in Samar. Whether it's this identity card or your adventurer class, they're all useless here, the innkeeper said with a snicker as he passed the identity card back to her. You want the regular service for your class? That's one of the funniest jokes that I've ever heard. Miss Nunn, you need to realize, this is Samar. This might be affiliated with the Adventurers Guild, but it's still the same no matter under which guild you're traveling. It's impossible to trust the identity cards of any of the bastards who've crawled their way here. Ah. Stop, that doesn't work either. What do you mean it doesn't work? Eugene asked with a furrowed brow as he was caught pulling out his wallet. The innkeeper elaborated. I'm talking about your money work here. So don't try to pull it out because it's pointless. Do you two really not know anything about Samar? Samar doesn't use any foreign currency. What's used here are. I already know that, so stop pointlessly interrupting me. Unless you want to get the shit beaten out of you, that is. Eugene threatened with a grin as he leaned closer over the table. On the other side of the table, the innkeeper was momentarily perplexed by Eugene's sudden change in attitude before muttering, What a rude young bastard. The innkeeper's expression twisted into a scowl as he placed a finger on the buzzer hidden beneath the table. With just one slight tap he could call down the mercenaries waiting on the upper floor. However, the innkeeper wasn't able to press the buzzer. A dagger that had pierced straight through to the underside of the table stopped just short of the innkeeper's finger. Hey now, no need to rush things. Eugene chided him. The innkeeper shakily demanded, You bastard, what the hell do you think you're doing? Eugene raised a brow. Didn't I tell you to keep listening until I was done speaking? Eugene took out a small jewel from the inside of his cloak and placed it on the table. It was one of the jewels that he had obtained from the emir of Khajitan. Seeing this, the innkeeper's eyes widened. We might not be able to use any of our foreign currencies, but we can still use gems, right? After all, everyone likes shiny things, Eugene grinned. The innkeeper was speechless. Now then, old man. From now on, stop interrupting me and just answer my questions, Eugene instructed. And stop trying to judge me based on my appearance and listen to the way I talk. Now you should be able to recognize a fellow mercenary who's made his living by the sword, isn't that so? The innkeeper's face stiffened slightly. He could sense the sharpness of the dagger that was touching his finger, and felt alarmed at the fact Eugene had stabbed it into the table without giving any signs in advance. That wasn't the only thing leaving him off balance. The killing intent that he could feel coming from this brat in front of him, who had yet to shed the air of youth, was far from ordinary. I'm the only one who can feel this, the innkeeper realized. Eugene's killing intent was all focused on the innkeeper without any wasted spillover. As a former mercenary, the innkeeper recognized that Eugene, unlike his outer appearance, was extremely dangerous. A jewel of this size should serve as the price of a room, Eugene proposed. The innkeeper silently sweated. Since there are two of us, we'll need 2 rooms, Eugene continued as he took out another jewel and placed it on the table. Although there are probably a lot of inns better than this, well, it's all about convenience. Do you get what I'm saying? Eugene prompted. The innkeeper belatedly realized, You need information? You've got it. If you're part of the Adventurers Guild, doesn't that mean you're also connected with the Mercenary Guild and the Informants Guild? While at the same time, you're also in charge of the accommodation for any adventurers, Eugene pointed out. The innkeeper hesitated and then asked, Are you 2 bounty hunters? As far as the innkeeper knew, the only ones who would usually stop by to ask for information while giving off such refined killing intent were bounty hunters. Well, I guess you could call us that, Eugene accepted. But as my stupid colleague here has already revealed, our purpose for coming here shouldn't be of any importance to you, right? I have the jewels that you want and you have the information that I want. Isn't that right, old man? The innkeeper hesitated. I'm just telling you this in advance. But if you try to do something like rob me because I look like an easy mark, you're all dead. I truly mean that, Eugene sincerely emphasized. I hope that you're tactful enough to see the difference between an unguarded bowl of rice and one that will take an arm off if you touch it. So what do you think, old man? Will you take the risk of trying to kill me just so that you can rifle through my pockets? That doesn't really sound like it would work, the innkeeper admitted. Eugene's killing intent was slowly growing stronger. The innkeeper's breath was rapidly hastening and cold sweat was flowing down his body. We're looking for an elf, Eugene said, reaching into his cloak once more. This time he took out a jewel that was several times the size of the first gem that he had taken out. The innkeeper's eyes lit up with desire as soon as he saw it. The greed that was aroused by this large gem was even greater than his fear of dying. Eugene continued, Not a dark elf, just a normal elf. From what I've been told, elves sometimes visit this city. So any one of them will do. It seems that you're not too familiar with our prices, the innkeeper coughed before continuing to speak. For information about the elves, we will need 3 jewels of the same size as that one. Although I don't know why you might be looking for an elf. It should be quite well known that there aren't just 1 or 2 wealthy merchants or nobles looking to own an elf. Seeing as you've said all that, it seems like you really do have information on the elves, right? Eugene confirmed. In exchange for one of those jewels, I can connect you with the informant, the innkeeper offered. You can discuss the rest of the cost with the informant himself. Eugene bared his teeth in a predatory grin as he growled, You motherfucker, where do you think you get off with trying to rip me off? Whoosh. Eugene's hand wrapped around the innkeeper's throat. Gack, the innkeeper choked. I don't mind if you scream a little louder, Eugene said generously as he kindly pressed the buzzer beneath the table in place of the innkeeper. The moment he had done so, rough-looking mercenaries immediately came racing down the stairs. "Sir Eugene?" Christina looked to Eugene in a fluster. Instead of answering her, Eugene just smirked at her and barked out orders. "Why aren't you pulling out your wand? Aren't you going to block those bastards from charging at us?" "Who the hell are you?" one of the mercenaries demanded. Eugene casually answered him, "We're a man and a woman, you son of a bitch." Crack. Eugene grabbed one of the innkeeper's fingers and snapped it. The mercenaries, who all looked dumbfounded by Eugene's confident remark, also snapped out of their bewilderment, and they drew their weapons and rushed over. Instead of reacting to this personally, Eugene glared at Christina. In response, Christina let out a short sigh and raised her hands in front of her chest. Fush. The light that erupted from her took the form of a long whip that swept her surroundings. Arg! The mercenaries all let out alarmed cries. Instead of sweeping the mercenaries away, the whip of light bound their arms and legs tightly. Seeing this, Eugene grinned and then turned back to the innkeeper. "Christina, what was this bastard's name again?" Eugene asked. "It's Jackson," Christina replied. "That's quite a common name," Eugene noted. "Hey Jackson. Didn't I say it just now? The reason I came here instead of some other inn, it's all for the sake of convenience." Crack crack. Jackson's finger was bent back even further. Although Jackson screamed and tried to twist himself free, Eugene's hand refused to let go of Jackson's throat. "I came here because I thought that you were an information dealer. But what did you say to me? You said that you'll just take a brokerage fee and connect me to your informant? Then you wanted me to sort out a separate payment with the informant? You motherfucker, where do you get off with ripping off your customers like this?" Eugene demanded. Jackson groaned. "Gah, gah. I didn't want to kick up a fuss, so I thought that I would just settle things cleanly by paying you some money, but I didn't expect you to have such a wicked heart." Eugene shook his head in dismay. "Now where was I? Oh right. The Informants Guild has its own set of laws, correct? I don't think that the laws of Samar's Informants Guild should be much different from its other branches. If you spout some nonsense during your duties, then you get your finger cut off, isn't that right?" The innkeeper stammered. "That law was repealed a long time ago." "When exactly was that, motherfucker?" 300 years ago. If that's the case, then what are the laws like now?" "Well, not that it matters. I'm not a member of the Informants Guild, so I don't really need to follow their laws, now do I? Since you've fucked with me, it's only fair that I fuck with you too, right?" Eugene's eyes widened as he glared at Jackson. Letting go of the finger that he had been holding beneath the table, Eugene slammed the dagger all the way through the table. "Come on, you son of a bitch. Which finger should I cut off? One on your right hand? Or your left hand? Even I have some sense of mercy, so I can avoid the hand that you use most often. You're right-handed, right? If that's the case, then I'll take one from your left hand. But if I take off your index finger, then that'll inconvenience your daily life, no? Since that's the case, I'll cut off your middle finger. That's probably better than your index finger. You might not be able to tell someone to fuck off with just your left hand, but if it's just that, it seems a pretty cheap price to pay for your stupidity," Eugene declared. Before they had entered, Christina had informed Eugene that the innkeeper's name was Jackson and that he was an information broker belonging to the Informants Guild. Originally, he had just intended to pay a reasonable price in order to purchase the necessary information, but things like plans had a habit of changing according to the situation. Christina might not be able to understand the reason for Eugene's sudden actions, but by Eugene's logic, it was always better to enforce discipline, even if it meant making a fuss, than to be treated like a fool. "Now then, why don't you just relax? Spread the fingers of your left hand wide so that it's easier for me to make the cut. You don't want to? If you don't want to, then I'll just add another one. How about both the middle and ring fingers?" Eugene offered. Jackson tried to warn him, If you hurt me, the Informants Guild will." "This bastard is really still trying to threaten me," Eugene snorted in derision. Whack. The sharp dagger cut off Jackson's middle finger. Jackson tried to scream, but Eugene covered his mouth with a hand to keep his scream from escaping. "If I was afraid of that, do you really think that I would be holding you by the throat as I cut off your fingers?" Eugene spat out as he glared into Jackson's trembling eyes. "Think carefully. Missing a single finger, while inconvenient, won't affect your life. If you speak up now, I'll let you off with just one finger. And you don't need to worry about payment. If your information is confirmed, then I'll even leave you these jewels. How had things turned out like this? Pain and fear clouded Jackson's head. The situation had been completely different just a few moments before. These two idiots had come in here without knowing anything. It had been surprising to hear them bring up the Informants Guild and the elves, with Jackson not caring what kind of circumstances had brought these two to Samar. Jackson had just wanted to take a brokerage fee. He really had been planning on connecting them with a suitable informant, but now all he had to see for it was the finger that had just been cut off. If you really don't want to cooperate, then it can't be helped. The Informants Guild is still just a guild. At the very least, for the crime of treating me like shit and wasting my time, I'm making sure that you die here. I'll also kill all the mercenaries that we have tied up over there. And after that, well, you won't need to care about that as you'll be dead. Isn't that right? As he said this, Eugene removed the hand that was covering Jackson's mouth. However, I hope that you can think about this clearly. If I'm able to come here and act so recklessly, that has to mean that I have something that I can firmly trust to have my back, no? Just who the hell are you? Jackson pleaded. It doesn't matter. Just tell me about the elves. With a scrape of the dagger, Eugene brushed away the finger that had fallen on the table. Please. I'm bleeding. Jackson stammered and Christina moved to approach him. However, Eugene took action before she could, grabbing the stump of Jackson's finger. Gah! Jackson screamed. Stay still. I've just stopped the bleeding, Eugene said. His method of stemming the blood loss was truly barbaric. By squeezing the severed finger he could stop the blood from pouring out. As Jackson's body shuddered in pain and fear, he looked down at his hand. He was afraid that Eugene's blood-stained hand might reach out to break or remove one of his other fingers. Now speak, Eugene said, sitting down on a chair with a casual expression on his face. Chapter 92, Samar 2. Weren't you being too unreasonable? Christina spoke up once they had left. Her question wasn't asked with any nitpicky nuance. It was just like during the actual event, where even though Christina had been surprised and flustered by the sudden change in situation, she hadn't gotten angry with Eugene's radical behavior. Seeing her react like this, Eugene felt quite impressed. If it had been an ordinary priest with him, they would have been enraged by Eugene's radical actions, going so far as to rebuke him for cutting off a finger, and would definitely have cast some healing magic on Jackson, who was in pain and dripping blood, without his permission. However, Christina hadn't done that. Although surprised and flustered, she hadn't tried to stop Eugene's actions. She hadn't even tried to cast any healing magic on her own volition. If I had an ordinary priest with me, Eugene mused. But in the first place, Christina was no ordinary priest. She was the Holy Empire of Uriza's saint candidate. No, their actual saint. So with Christina's actions on top of her background and thanks to her appearance as well, Eugene couldn't help but be strongly reminded once more of a niece. You have to be unreasonable when dealing with unreasonable bastards, Eugene said as he glanced back at her. Also, aren't you being the unreasonable one by even asking that? If you converted the jewels I took out in front of him into cash, do you know how much that would be? As long as he got a good deal on just one of them, he would have had enough cash to drink and party with for a whole year. Since he tried to pocket one of them for free by using such a nonsensical excuse, don't you think that he got off rather cheaply with just losing a finger? Christina hummed as she considered this for a few moments, then she smiled softly and nodded. Indeed. I understand what you are trying to say. You and I might now come from backgrounds where we have no shortage of money, but for ordinary people, the jewels that you offered must be of great value, Christina agreed as she lowered the hood of her robe. On top of that, both of us grew up in a very poor environment in our younger days. As such, we both appreciate the value of wealth even more. Eugene nodded. I'm glad that you understand. However, Christina interrupted him. Even taking all that into account, I still feel like cutting off that information broker's finger was overkill. It would have been enough just to scold him, there was no need to go that far. Would a bastard who makes a living by selling information in a place like this really back down from simple threats? Taking a single finger was instead the cleanest way to handle things, Eugene insisted. What if he wants revenge for this? Christina asked. Do you think he'd be that stupid? Sometimes anger can consume all reason. Rather than abandoning all his fear and attempting something like that, that guy will probably just lie there, fantasizing about getting his revenge, Eugene muttered as he turned away from her, looking forward once more. Nevertheless, if he does try to take revenge on me, I'll just have to make him regret taking such a foolish choice of action. As someone with enough ability to be confident in my chances, I would actually prefer if he did instead choose to try and get revenge. Indeed, Christina muttered with a giggle. It seemed like she hadn't just asked her initial question because she wanted Eugene to explain his reasoning. Sir Eugene, you are quite the unusual individual, Christina commented. Why do you say that? Eugene asked. After all, isn't Kiel's Lionheart clan one of the most prestigious families on the entire continent? However, your earlier behavior was so cruel that it was hard to believe that you were the heir of such a prestigious family. You were acting just like a hard-as-nails mercenary, Christina praised. Do you really see the children of prestigious families as the type to just laugh pretentiously and sip tea even as they're getting ripped off? Eugene asked rhetorically. Let's just be frank with each other. You can just say that you feel like I'm too unreasonable to be a young master from a prestigious family. Christina smiled. That's what I said at the very beginning. Weren't you being too unreasonable? Eugene burst into laughter as he recalled the words that he had indeed heard earlier. Still, at least I didn't kill him, Eugene defended himself. Instead, you cut his hand off at the wrist, Christina reminded him. He needed to pay the price for his mistakes, Eugene curtly declared. Jackson had refused to talk about the elves. I can't say anything, Jackson had said as he begged for mercy. 300 years ago, when the 5 demon kings had been trying to take over the world, the 2 races that had suffered the most damage were the elves and the dragons. There hadn't been many dragons in the first place, but then half of them were killed while fighting against the demon kings. The elves were even worse off than the dragons. They had started gradually dying even before any of the elves could have fought back against the demon kings. This was all because of a plague. The ominous power of the demon kings proved fatal to the pure and untainted elves. The shocking pandemic that ensued, called the demonic disease, brought many of these elves despite their long lifespans to an untimely death. Elves who felt sickened by the world, elves who had barely escaped being taken as slaves, and elves who had caught the demonic disease. Their reasons varied, but various groups of elves had all found their way back to the Samar rainforest. The elves who had been born in the forest and had then left for the outside world, all wished to return to their hometown. The elves who weren't born in the forest arrived searching for the elven sanctuary that they heard was located deep within the forest. The elves who had caught the demonic disease had an even more desperate reason for returning than the other elves. Once they were infected, they would only be able to persist for 5 years at the very most before dying, but those who returned to the Samar forest would be able to live for a much longer period of time. Eugene didn't know if it had always been like this, but lately, not a single one of the elves that had attempted to return were able to find the elven sanctuary. Elves lived for a very long time, they were beautiful, and no matter how old they got, their natural beauty wouldn't age. As such, there weren't just a few wealthy merchants and nobles who were looking to enslave the elves. For people like this, their eyes couldn't help but light up with enthusiasm at the elves' predicament, treating these wandering elves as their prey. If it was just a few years ago, this city may have been filled with numerous slavers and slave traders who had come here from abroad. But now, there were none. There might be a few who were continuing their work under the table, but the number of slavers and slave traders who were working out in the open had seriously dwindled. This was because of the Dark Elves. Starting from a few years ago, the Dark Elves had appeared in this city and formed a force that counter-hunted these slavers and slave traders. These vicious Dark Elves had sealed the mouths of the Informants Guild, and they were the only ones allowed to contact any elf that appeared in this city. Why? Because they wanted to turn these wandering elves into Dark Elves. They would persuade these elves who had come to Samar that no matter how much they wandered around, they wouldn't be able to find the elven sanctuary. The elves already living there had hidden their borders, and were actively rejecting any of their people who came in from the outside. But if the wandering elves became Dark Elves instead, they would no longer need to worry about slavers and slave traders. They would also no longer need to worry about a sudden onset of the demonic disease. In fact, it was even alright if they had already caught the demonic disease. Dark Elves wouldn't die from it. Are you familiar with the Princess of Fury? Christina asked. Nights in the forest were both long and dark. Christina had no objections to living rough. She might be a saint, but she was far from dead weight. She gathered firewood on her own, started a campfire, and helped set up camp. I've heard of her, Eugene confirmed. It was Iris, the dark elf that he hadn't been able to kill 300 years ago. Fury's adopted daughter. I should have killed her back then, Eugene regretted. Oberon had sworn himself to the Demon King of Destruction, and then died when his own son ripped out his throat. Iris hadn't subordinated herself to any of the other demon kings or demon folk. While claiming that she was the Demon King of Fury's legitimate heir, she had established her own platform in Helmuth, campaigning to become one of the new demon kings. She made a valid case. The vampires and the lycanthropes had submitted themselves to the queen of the night demons, Morgiabella. Oberon's son and the other beastfolk had continued to swear allegiance to the Demon King of Destruction. The only ones who hadn't subordinated themselves to one of the other demon kings or demon folk were the giants and the dark elves. However, the giants made no claim as to being the heirs of Fury, and instead lived among themselves in the backwoods of Helmuth. In the end, only Iris now claimed to be the heir of Fury, while aiming for the throne of the Demon King. Setting aside the power that she holds, the Princess of Fury, Iris isn't very well considered in Helmuth. Christina continued speaking as she stared into the campfire. Even in the Alcardi diocese where I lived, there was a lot of mockery being spread about Iris. As someone who wasn't a pure-blooded demon folk and instead something like a dark elf, they ridiculed her for not knowing her place and coveting the throne of the Demon King. Well, the concept of a pure-blooded demon folk is also ridiculous, Eugene said with a snort as he chewed on his meat. In the first place, in terms of pure-bloodedness apart from the demons, 1. What other race of demon folk can actually claim to be pure-blooded? The night demons and the other demon folk are all subspecies of the demons. However, they were at least born as demon folk, Christina pointed out. Things hadn't been that different 300 years ago either. Those like the vampires and lycanthropes, namely those who had been converted from humans and were considered part of the demon folk, would be despised by the pure-blooded demon folk as being half-demons or hybrids. In contrast to the half-demons, the treatment of the black wizards by the demon folk was much better. This was because there was a clear sense of hierarchy between them. As the foster daughter of the Demon King of Fury, Iris is able to corrupt elves into dark elves even though she is not a demon king. Eugene continued the discussion. That was why he felt such regret. If he had only been able to kill Iris 300 years ago, the dark elves would no longer have increased in number. I'm aware of many high-ranking demon folk in Helmuth who offered Iris their support, but she has refused any such support and insists on building up her own platform solely through her own strength, Christina added. How funny, Eugene muttered as he even chewed off the bits of meat still stuck to the bone. Even as she's being despised by those purebloods, in the end she too insists on being pure-blooded. With the elves already being so few in number, the number of dark elves is even smaller. Does she really intend to build up her own force from such a shadow of a race, compete with the other demon folk and successfully become a demon king? She sure does dream big. There was no way that Iris could become a demon king. Eugene was well aware of the power that the demon folk had held 300 years ago. Iris was definitely strong, but there was no way that her strength could greatly surpass that of the other highest-ranking demon folk such as the Queen of the Night Demons. There was also no comparison between their forces. If a new demon king was truly born from amongst the demon folk, the closest to that position were the three dukes of Helmuth. Queen of the Night Demons Morgiabella. Incarceration's Blade, Gavid Lindman. Black Dragon Raizakia. The three of them were so deeply entangled together that they were practically sick of each other. But that's exactly why, out of all of the demon folk who were on the same level as them 300 years ago, they're the only three remaining, Eugene mused. Jackson had spilled everything he knew about the Dark Elves as he kept weeping. He told Eugene that if he leaked any information about the elves, the Dark Elves were sure to kill him, so he begged Eugene not to question him about the elves. In other words, Jackson had had no intention of giving them any info about the elves from the very beginning, but he had still been trying to pocket the information and brokerage fees. It seems like Iris isn't following the orders of the Demon King of Incarceration and the Demon King of Destruction, Eugene observed. So when clashing with the Dark Elves he wouldn't have to worry about any interference from the Demon Kings. The only one that he really needed to keep an eye out for was Iris. At least there should be no reason for me to run into Iris here, thought Eugene. He had been told that the Dark Elves took all the elves that they had managed to persuade back with them to Helmuth. The only one who could corrupt elves was Iris. In other words, This meant that she shouldn't be in the Samar rainforest and was instead still somewhere in Helmuth. Their conversation had died, leaving only the sounds of the campfire burning and the insects chirping. Without saying a word, Christina was sipping on a hot cup of tea. Eugene was cleaning up the last of the meat skewers. "What are you planning to do?" Christina eventually spoke up after a long silence. "Do I need to get your permission?" Eugene asked as he chewed the last of the meat. "What are you asking permission for?" "Murder." Christina hesitated. "Although that's not something I can really grant permission for. I will pray in your stead, Sir Eugene." "You're going to pray for my sin of murder to be forgiven?" Eugene asked sarcastically. "Not at all. Instead it will be a prayer of remembrance and purification," Christina said with a soft smile as she brought her hands together to her chest. How could it even be considered a sin to punish the servants of the devil? However, they are all still life who were born and raised on their earth, as lambs who should have been led into the light. Our prayers are for the sake of illuminating their souls that have been corrupted by darkness, and guiding them back onto the path of righteousness. It seems like all saints are crazy people, Eugene thought, recalling Anise as he swallowed his last bite of meat. Earth to earth. In addition to her divine magic, Anise was also good at wielding her flail, too. Ashes to ashes. Her brightly shining flail had smashed more than a few demon folk heads into pieces. Dust to dust. Although there weren't many occasions where Anise had to put her flail to work, when caught in a scrum, she would lift her flail up with a helpless expression and go into battle. Brilliant light. Illuminate the darkness. She would break heads with her flail, create a mist with her true holy water and unfurl her gleaming wings. As she did all this while screaming out prayers, Anise looked more like a madman than she did a saint. "By any chance do you wield a flail as well?" Eugene asked cautiously. "Huh?" Christina asked. "A flail, are you not familiar with them?" "I know what they are, but I prefer to wield a mace." "A mace?" Eugene repeated. "Yes. Although they're heavy, so I haven't been carrying one with me," Christina reluctantly admitted. Eugene hesitantly offered, "If you need one, just tell me. I have a few inside of my cloak." "Thank you very much." Just as Christina had given her thanks with a gentle smile, something flew out of the darkness and fell to the ground, rolling straight towards them. Eugene and Christina didn't show any alarm and just stared at the rolling object. It was the head of the information broker, Jackson. The head's tongue was sticking out, and its eyes had rolled so far back so only the whites could be seen. "About that mace, will you lend me one now?" Christina requested. "No," Eugene denied her and just wiped his hands on his trousers as he got up. "Since you've said that I don't need your permission, just stay here and pray." They had immediately noticed when someone had started stealthily approaching them. During their shared silence, the intruder had narrowed the distance, so even before Eugene had asked Christina for permission, Eugene had already decided what he was going to do to them. A question came flying out of the darkness. "Are you a slaver? If we tell you that we aren't, are you just going to leave?" Eugene responded with a casual tone. "I've heard that you're going around asking about the elves," the voice said as it drew a little closer. A dark elf came walking out of the darkness to face Eugene. Eugene questioned the dark elf. He was just an old man trying to make a living in this cutthroat world of ours. "You didn't need to kill him, right?" The dark elf ignored his question. "The informant told me all about you. He said that you came to him suddenly and wanted to buy information about the elves. But he refused to sell us any information about the elves," Eugene noted. "You don't seem to be surprised. Have you already heard about us?" the dark elf asked. Without answering the question, Eugene pulled out a folded handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his mouth. Seeing this needlessly fastidious act, the dark elf put on a puzzled expression. "Could it be that you don't understand what kind of situation you're in?" the dark elf demanded. Eugene shook off the handkerchief a few times and asked, "Did you come here on your own?" "What?" "I asked you if you came here on your own," Eugene repeated as he tossed the handkerchief into the air. "You impudent bastard." Before the handkerchief hit the ground, it was blown away by a storm. Chapter 93, Samar 3. In the face of the oncoming wind, the dark elf's expression changed abruptly. He quickly retreated backward while reaching for his waist, but Eugene was faster and was onto him before he could do anything. This was an inevitable outcome. The summoned wind was only for the sake of surprising the dark elf. Eugene had used the blink spell for movement. Without holding any weapons, Eugene pounced on the dark elf with his bare hands, but the dark elf wasn't making it easy to capture him. He bent his body backward, and then in this unstable position, the dark elf swiveled in place, in a movement that could almost be called acrobatic. By doing so, he brought his legs swinging around toward Eugene. Eugene snickered. He twisted his outstretched arm and blocked the dark elf's kick with the back of his hand. It wasn't just an ordinary block either. The wind covertly swirling around Eugene's hand swallowed the dark elf's body. Ugh, the dark elf grunted. The wind was as sharp as a blade. Engulfed the center of this storm, the dark elf protected his head with both of his arms while drawing on his strength. Crush. Gray-colored mana wrapped around the dark elf's body. His mana is quite high level, but his demonic power is nothing special, Eugene observed. The dark elf was only a little better than the lower-level demon folk in terms of demonic power. However, his skills were far superior to any of the lower-level demon folk. Just like elves, dark elves also lived a long time. Although a 100-year-old human would be so old that it wouldn't be strange for them to die at any time, a 100-year-old elf was treated like a child by their own people. The elves were one of those races who were blessed with an overflowing amount of time. Even if they just diligently cultivated their mana during all that time, any elf could become strong enough that no human would be able to look down on them. With all that said, were elves unconditionally superior to humans? That wasn't necessarily the case. 300 years ago, Vermouth had definitely been a human. Molan, Anise, Sienna as well as Hamel had all been humans. Humans were so numerous that they outnumbered the elves by the tens of hundreds. And amongst this overcrowded population, one could sometimes find monsters who were able to ignore the difference in lifespan. The dark elf who had come here today couldn't have imagined that he would be facing one such monster. But now there was no need to imagine it. The reality of the situation was clear. The dark elf couldn't understand why or how he had been thrown to the ground. The reality that he was facing right now had far exceeded the limits of his common sense. Gag. The dark elf coughed. Even though he had yet to understand the situation, his lips opened by themselves as blood sprayed out of his mouth. It had looked like a clean and simple back throw, but was that really all there was to it? No, before the dark elf had even hit the ground, Eugene had struck him a few more times. Eugene had first reached out to the hand that was holding onto a dagger, grabbed it and twisted it. As the dark elf's arm was pulled in toward his side, his elbows were slammed against his own ribs. His mana shield was crushed by this blow and the bones in his arm were broken. A rising fist then slightly brushed against the dark elf's chin. For a moment the dark elf completely lost consciousness. In the next instant the dark elf landed onto the ground back first. His arms, ribs and shoulders. His whole body trembled as if it had been electrocuted. Not only were his bones broken, his internal organs had also been damaged, so every time he took a breath, the fishy smell of blood filled his throat. Struggling any further would be trivial and futile. What had happened to him was so one-sided it couldn't even be called a fight. The dark elf gasped for breath as he glared up at Eugene. Although he was aware of these facts, the dark elf wasn't a true warrior. He didn't feel any respect for the opponent who had just defeated him. A human boy like you, the dark elf growled angrily. Drawing the dark elf here had been intentional. Rather than attacking the dark elf's stronghold, Eugene had been intending to get the dark elves to pursue him by using Jackson as bait. If Jackson had been terrified enough to keep quiet, he wouldn't have been able to draw out any of the dark elves, but Eugene had made sure that he wouldn't just keep quiet. That was why he had cut off one of Jackson's hands. I'm not sure how I should react to that. I am a human and I'm young enough to be considered a boy, so should I still take your words as the insult they were intended to be? Eugene muttered as he brushed off the dirt that had splashed up onto his cloak. The dark elf coughed up another mouthful of blood, and tried to push himself up with his still intact left arm. I'll kill you, the dark elf groaned out. Eugene had gotten used to hearing such words in these kinds of situations. This meant that he knew there wasn't any value in continuing to listen to them. Without any hesitation, Eugene raised his foot and stomped on the dark elf's left hand. Crackle. There went the sound of bones being crushed. Gaw. Unable to endure the pain, the dark elf screamed. One feature of the dark elf's appearance that stood out as much as any member of the elven race was his long ears. As their length suggested, these long ears expanded the range of their hearing. This excellent sense of hearing allowed the dark elf to know precisely what kind of situation he had found himself in. The screams that he let out weren't spreading into the distance, and were instead echoing back within a small, confined area. A spell, the dark elf realized. The sound wasn't able to spread because it had been blocked from doing so. The dark elf didn't let out any further screams, and just grunted with effort as he tried to free his pinned-down hand. However, Eugene refused to release the dark elf's hand, and just crouched down on the spot so that he could look into the dark elf's eyes. He had brown skin and crimson eyes. The characteristic traits of a dark elf hadn't changed since 300 years ago. Eugene reached out to him with an apathetic expression. He pulled off the dark elf's cloak, then he tore open the collar as well. The dark elf's eyes started to shake. His face twisted into a grimace, and he spat the blood that collected in his mouth onto Eugene's face. "You son of a bitch," the dark elf cursed. "I'd rather die than be violated by someone like you." Eugene interrupted him. "What kind of nonsense are you yelping, you bastard? Why the hell would you think I'd be interested in violating you? In the first place, this dark elf was a man, and even if it had been a woman Eugene would have rejected taking such an action without even blinking. Even when he was making a living as a mercenary in his previous life, Eugene had never once forcibly taken a woman. "Let's see now." "That's right, just as I thought," Eugene muttered to himself. Eugene stared down at the tattoo that marked the dark elf from his left collarbone to his chest. It was in the shape of an upside-down goat's skull, the horns of which had an unusual form. They were actually two pairs of horns growing out of the same base, one curved and one straight. An upside-down goat's skull with two pairs of horns was the sigil of the Demon King of Fury. The fact that this dark elf had a tattoo of it on his chest was proof that he was a subordinate of the Demon King of Fury. But if he was alive 300 years ago, there's no way that he'd be this sloppy, thought Eugene. This meant that he had probably become a dark elf relatively recently, and had just entered Iris's service. Or else he could just be young. Either way, this dark elf was definitely one of Iris's subordinates. "There are a few things that I want to ask you, so if at all possible, I hope that you can kindly cooperate with me," Eugene requested. "Just kill me," the dark elf spat out. Wasn't it obvious what kind of questions a slaver would ask? The dark elf had no intention of loosening his lips and betraying his people, even if it meant his death. Eugene tried to persuade him. "If you're going to die anyway, wouldn't it be better for you to die painlessly?" Although he had at least tried to convince the dark elf, Eugene didn't believe that it would be so easy to get this dark elf to open his mouth. That was why he had placed a seal on this location so that any sounds wouldn't carry for too far. Eugene didn't like torture. However, he also wasn't the type to hesitate in its use when the situation called for it. Eugene now held the dagger that he had stolen from the dark elf in one hand. "It looks like this might take a while, so why don't you go get some sleep first instead of waiting up?" Eugene offered to Christina. "Allow me to offer you my help," Christina said as she stood up. Eugene snorted and turned around to look back at her. "And how do you intend to do that? Are you going to make him repent by reciting prayers at him? Or are you thinking of smashing his fingers into bits with a mace?" "I don't need to use such rough methods," Christina said with a smile as she walked over to Eugene's side. Eugene shrugged and stepped over the dark elf, then pulled on the dark elf's left arm so that it was twisted behind his back. "So what are you planning to do?" Eugene asked. "An interrogation," Christina said as she pulled out her wand. The cross at the end of the wand was held up to Christina's chest. With a calm smile, she stared at the dark elf. Eventually, Christina's lips twitched. Fwoosh. A short spell was cast using her divine power. The blue jewel embedded into the center of the cross shone in resonance with the divine power that Christina had aroused. This flickering light was directed at the dark elf. As dark elves were corrupted by demonic power, they instinctively rejected divine power. The dark elf started sweating profusely as he tried to twist his body free of Eugene's hold. "Look at me," Christina whispered. Her smile exuded benevolence and her voice rang as sweet as a child's. Eugene was startled. "This is..." Still holding the arm of the dark elf behind his back, Eugene had a front-row view to what Christina was doing. However, he couldn't tell what holy magic Christina was currently using. Anise had never used a divine spell like this. On the other hand, while studying magic at Akron, Eugene had gotten to know various different types of magic. Although it was impossible for him to personally learn any divine spells, He had read a few books on holy magic. Mental magic was of a different category from normal magic. The only place that dealt with mental magic in depth was the Black Tower of Magic. However, if one went beyond the strict boundaries of magic, it wasn't black magic that was most adept at manipulating the target's mental state according to the caster's will. The true master of this kind of activity was holy magic. 300 years ago, back when black wizards were still widely reviled, the Holy Empire of Eurus's inquisitors were the greatest fear of all black wizards. In those days, everyone was united in their hatred of the black wizards, but the inquisitors of Eurus in particular didn't even see black wizards as human beings. In today's era, inquisitors weren't as fearsome as they used to be 300 years ago. This was because they were no longer in an era where they were given free rein to go wherever and do whatever they wanted in the name of hunting these black wizards. However, the inquisitors could still be found in Eurus. They watched over the priests of the Holy Empire, and served as a warning not to falter in one's faith. You even know how to use this type of divine spell? Eugene commented. I don't enjoy using it, Christina said defensively. It would have been better if you had just used it earlier, Eugene complained. Are you talking about using it on the informant? He might have had a bad temper, but he was just an ordinary human. He wasn't even a lapsed follower of the God of Light. Christina lowered her wand and straightened back up. The dark elf, who had been stammering while under the control of the spell, was now muttering to himself with his head bowed low, in a garbled tongue where it was impossible to make out any actual words. As you can see, now that his will is broken and his mind has collapsed, I have managed to extract a confession straight from his heart, Christina explained. Although it might have been possible for her to do so, Anise had never once used such a spell. Taking this into account, the interrogation spell isn't one that should be used lightly, and I personally also dislike using it. However, since this is a fallen elf, there was no reason to hesitate in interrogating him, Christina said as she brought her hands together in prayer. Through his confession we will be brought one step closer to completing our divine mission. Surely God's ear will be drawn towards listening to this poor soul's confession, and his hand shall guide this soul darkened by corruption back into the land of light. So you're saying that it's all right to kill him then? Eugene surmised. It's not about killing, it's about purifying the soul, Christina said with a broad smile. What a snake-like woman. Although it wasn't exactly the same, Christina also had an unknowable side to her, just like Anise. They were also similar in the way that they sinisterly hid their true feelings behind a smile. Eugene grabbed the limp dark elf by the collar and dragged the elf up with him as he stood up. Despite the rough treatment, the dark elf was still vacantly muttering to himself. Although Eugene had been intending to go find a quiet corner in which to execute the dark elf, Christina didn't stay put as expected and instead followed Eugene. He decided to let her do what she wanted. Instead of just slicing open the dark elf's throat, Eugene laid him down onto the ground and placed a hand on his chest. A few moments later, the dark elf's heart suddenly stopped. After watching this scene take place with some surprise, Christina walked over to the side of the pulseless elf and knelt down. Then she placed her hands together and after spending a few moments in prayer, she lifted her wand. Fwoosh! The light summoned by Christina swallowed the dark elf's body. Not long afterwards, the dark elf's body transformed into ashes and then completely disappeared. Almighty God of light, please receive this corrupted soul and render unto him your judgment. Please light up the darkness in his soul with your light, and burn away the karma that he has accrued during his life with your flaming torch, Christina prayed. Christina's prayers were similar to, but also different from the prayers that had been engraved onto Hamel's grave. But the basic core on which their prayers were based could still be seen in both cases. Was my help of some assistance? Christina asked as she finished her prayer and stood up. Yep, Eugene answered honestly. If it wasn't for Christina's interrogation spell, he would have had to spend a long night in this forest torturing the dark elf. Let's postpone our rest for tonight, Eugene proposed. Are you worried that we might be pursued? Christina asked. The dark elf was alone and hadn't brought any companions. That said, it was still better for them not to keep camping there, at a place where they had already come into contact with one dark elf. And since there was nothing wrong with being careful, it was better for them to keep moving during the early hours of the morning. We also have a long way to go, Eugene added. They had learned several things through the interrogation. They may have already confirmed it with the tattoo, but the dark elf had personally admitted to being Iris's subordinate. He was a member of Fury's Independence Army. With Iris at its head, the Independence Army was an organization made up solely of dark elves. While they were increasing their manpower by recruiting the elves who came to Samar, they were also searching for the undiscovered elven sanctuary. Apart from that, they had also learned something about the elves. There were still elves who had rejected their persuasion to become dark elves and who had instead headed into the depths of the rainforest. These elves knew that they were highly valued as slaves, and they also knew that many of the barbaric tribes that lived in the rainforest had no regard for the elves. The guiding purpose of these elves was to find their way to the elven sanctuary where the world tree hopefully still stood tall. However, as the road leading to it was blocked, the elves who weren't able to enter the sanctuary had gathered together and formed a new village. To reach this village from the outskirts of the Samar rainforest, no matter how fast they traveled, it would take the two at least a month to get there. Then there's the matter of the guardian, Eugene mused. In the village where the wandering elves had gathered, there was said to be a guardian who protected the village from attacks by slavers and other barbarian tribes. It said that the elves living there shun all contact with humans, Christina brought up cautiously. We just need to make them feel welcoming, Eugene stated confidently. How do we do that? Christina asked uncertainly. Just because they're elves, do you really think that they would reject all gifts? Eugene replied with a shrug. There's no one in the world who doesn't like a gift. The dark elf that they had just interrogated didn't know anything about the elven sanctuary. Just like Eugene had expected, he was a young elf who hadn't been born within the sanctuary and had instead been born somewhere outside the forest. What Eugene was looking for was elves who had lived inside the sanctuary. If at all possible, it should be someone who also knows about Sienna, Eugene thought hopefully. If it was an elf who had left the sanctuary around 200 years ago, they might have even run into Sienna on their way out. Chapter 94, Samar 4. Elves were swift-footed. Especially in the forest, where elves ran so fast that it looked as if they were receiving magical assistance. However, elves or otherwise, there was no way that they could still run that fast on just a single leg. A one-legged elf could run fast enough that it was hard to believe that they were one-legged, but it was impossible for them to outrun the skilled slavers that were after them. Their one heart felt like it was about to burst, their sloppy prosthetic leg had already started to shatter, and their head felt like it was spinning. The elf had a gut feeling that it wouldn't be long before they collapsed. But they absolutely couldn't allow themselves to do so. After having finally reached Samar, they were afraid that once they collapsed, they would open their eyes again not knowing where they were. Hi-ya! The sharp cries of their pursuers were drawing closer. This sound was the hunting cry of the rainforest's native tribes. The tribal warriors were whooping cheerfully as they chased down the fleeing elf on the back of their mounts, the giant Vakan wolves. If they had wanted to, they could have caught their prey right away. By not doing so, they were trying to keep their prey from breaking down in despair. Elves were highly sought-after prey. Rather than catching these elves and using them as slaves of the tribe, the native slavers preferred to sell them to the foreign slave traders who came all the way to Samar just to purchase these elves. As such, they couldn't allow themselves to seriously injure their prey. Since the value of the elf had already dropped due to the fact that it was one-legged, if they left a scar on its body as well, the drop in price would be more than they could accept. The elf, who had been running with a limp, came to a halt with a sharp gasp. Because they had been running like crazy, they hadn't been paying any attention to the sounds of their surroundings. No, more than that, it was because their reason had been clouded by the terrifying cries of the natives. This was what had led them to almost run off the edge of a cliff. With shaking eyes, the elf looked down. The foot off the cliff, a great distance below, was covered by a flowing river. They needed to find a different path. Limping, the elf made to withdraw. But then a long spear thudded into the ground near the elf. Kaya! The elf let out a scream as their shoulders trembled in fright. The tribal warriors were blocking the elf's way back from the cliff. The Vakan wolves carrying the warriors were letting out growling sounds as they bared their sharp fangs. The hideously masked natives snickered as they gestured towards the elf. The meaning behind their gestures was that the elf should just give up resistance and quietly allow themselves to be caught. The elf bit down on their trembling lips. There was no way that they could communicate with these barbarians. After they had first encountered each other, the elf had tried begging them for mercy several times, But the natives only ever spoke amongst themselves in a language that only they knew the meaning of. The elf hesitantly stepped backward. A few of the natives who had gotten down from the backs of their Vakan wolves approached the elf. They had put down their spears and spread their arms wide, as if to show that they didn't intend any harm to the elf. But behind their round masks with eye sockets that looked like they had been torn open with a knife, the elf saw the greed and lust gleaming within their eyes. Their gazes drove the elf's body to make a risky move. Swallowing an instinctive scream, the elf threw themselves off of the cliff. Stomp stomp. Having rolled up her trouser cuffs, Christina was stomping her laundry. Prior to becoming a saint candidate, she had been an orphan abandoned at a monastery. Thanks to this, she was used to chores like doing the laundry. "It seems like you're enjoying yourself," Christina sourly commented as she turned to glare at Eugene with narrowed eyes. Although she was used to them, it didn't mean that she enjoyed them. "It's not like I'm just playing around." Eugene defended himself. Eugene had set up a fishing rod and was sitting by the river. But after having done all that, he wasn't even focusing on fishing. Instead, he had even brought out a chair for him to sit comfortably on and was absorbed in a book of magic. "By reading this book of magic, I learn more magic, and by learning more magic, I become stronger," Eugene insisted. "As I get stronger, the risks that we'll face further along in our journey are reduced. If that happens, then..." "You're quite wordy today," Christina interrupted him. "That's because I've already had to say this several times now, but you keep questioning me. If you didn't want to suffer like this, then you shouldn't have followed me," Eugene said with a dismissive shrug as he flipped the page. "It's not like I'm playing around. And it's not like I'm overworking you either. Aren't you familiar with the term role allocation?" "You're right, I said something pointless. So please just focus on your reading," Christina said exasperatedly. Eugene continued despite her protests. "It's not like I'm making you do chores like the laundry all the time either. I take care of the hunting and the fighting, and I also handle drying the laundry. All you need to do is the laundry and the cooking, right? Even then, your cooking doesn't taste that good, so I'm the one who usually handles it. Weren't you going to do some studying?" Christina reminded him. "Now that I've brought it up, I have to say, there's way too many problems with how you cook," Eugene continued his lecture. "Haven't I already told you so many times that I prefer stronger flavors? And the meat should not be overcooked, just to an extent where it's slightly dripping with blood. I'm doing it out of concern for your body, Sir Eugene." Christina defended herself. "I suspect that you're just cooking according to your own tastes," Eugene accused. "I'm at the peak of health, so I won't catch anything from eating a dripping red steak that's been smothered in spices." Christina stopped protesting and just kept her lips shut. It had already been over a month since they had first entered this forest. A lot had happened along the way, and Christina had gotten a good grasp of how intractable Eugene's personality was. Especially when it came to arguments, as Christina had never been able to defeat Eugene in a straight debate. Christina had always thought that as a priest she should maintain a compassionate heart, but after talking with Eugene she felt the urge to forget about her priesthood and just sock him in the back of his head. "Does that book happen to have any spells related to washing clothes written in it?" Christina asked hopefully. "Does your holy magic have any laundry spells?" Eugene returned the question. "Why would holy magic have any spells for doing the laundry?" Christina protested. "Then why should I have to learn any laundry spells?" Eugene pointed out. "How many times will I ever end up having to do my own laundry?" This was actually a lie. Among the various spells that Eugene had learned in Aroth, there were also a few laundry spells. He had just started making Christina do the laundry as a bit of a prank to relieve his boredom. However, if he came clean now and told her that he did actually know how to use magic to do the laundry, he was afraid that he might just end up getting socked right in the kisser by Christina. On top of that, what Christina was washing now was her own clerical uniform. Eugene had plenty of clothes packed into his cloak that he could change into, but Christina didn't share that option. Christina also had a bag that had some spatial enchantments cast on it, but her bag didn't have as much storage space as the Cloak of Darkness. As they wandered through the forest, they couldn't go a day without getting their clothes dirty somehow, but Christina couldn't stand having any dirt on her clerical uniform, which was always meant to be kept scrupulously clean. "You can just wear some other clothes. If a priest doesn't wear their clerical clothing, what else are they supposed to wear? Especially as it is by God's will that I am accompanying you, Sir Eugene, so I absolutely cannot take off my priestly garb." It wasn't like he didn't get where she was coming from. In Eugene's previous life, Anise had also stubbornly insisted on wearing her clerical uniform while they were traveling. Although in Helmuth she just wore whatever she picked up, Eugene recalled. In any case, this meant that it was Christina herself who had decided that it was a good idea to do the laundry barefoot in cold river water. As such, Eugene didn't feel any guilt about not using laundry spells to help her. He would be drying the wet clothes with the help of a wind spirit once Christina was done with washing her laundry, and wasn't doing that much already helpful enough? Eugene suddenly hummed as he paused his reading of the magical text and raised his head. This wasn't in reaction to movement from the fishing rod. Getting up from his chair, Eugene dusted off the seat of his pants and turned to look upstream. "Is it a monster?" Christina asked, turning to look at Eugene while pausing in the midst of wringing her robes dry. This forest was infested with monsters, but they couldn't discount the possibility of it being bandits either. But since they were doing their laundry near a river, it was more likely that they had managed to provoke one of the monsters living in the river into attacking them. "No," Eugene replied as he picked up the fishing rod. "It's a big catch." With a grin, Eugene cast his fishing rod. As the long fishing line spooled out, it was covered by Eugene's mana. Eugene manipulated the fishing line using his will and caught onto an object that had come floating in from upstream. "An elf?" Christina questioned with an alarmed expression. Eugene pulled the elf that he had caught onto the riverbank. The tropical Samar rainforest was always muggy, but the water of the river was cold. After looking down at the pale, exhausted body of the elf, Eugene stretched out his hand. Though the elf's body was as cold as ice, they were still barely breathing. Eugene first summoned a wind spirit to dry their wet clothes, then created a flame using magic. "Christina," Eugene called out. "Yes," Christina responded as she immediately stopped what she was doing and came to the elf's side. A bright light shone from her hands and swept over the elf's body. With this, color returned to their skin quickly enough that the change could be seen with the naked eye. "So they're a slave," Eugene confirmed. Lifting the hem of their clothing, Eugene found a mark that had been branded on them near their navel. Although slavery had already been abolished during his previous life, even back then there were an abundant amount of illegal slaves. "The leg," Christina muttered in concern. "It was amputated a long time ago. They must have cut it off themselves," Eugene said as he glanced down at the elf's left leg. The surface of the stump looked like it had been roughly abraded and blood kept flowing from it. It looked like their cheap prosthetic leg had dug into their flesh. Could they have escaped from a slave trader? Christina speculated. "We'll find out as soon as we wake them up," Eugene answered. Although the elf's circumstances were pitiable, their coincidental meeting could be considered a stroke of luck for Eugene. Eugene grabbed the elf by the shoulders and lightly shook them a few times. "Cough." Before even opening their eyes, the elf let out a cough and vomited out some water. Then they moaned as they tried to twist their body free from Eugene's hold. "You shouldn't move around so much," Eugene warned them. They may have given the elf some emergency treatment, but even when putting it generously, the elf couldn't be described as being in good health. Bruises covered their entire body and the number of fractures. These injuries didn't appear to be from an assault. They were probably sustained by falling into the water from a great height. "Kaya!" the elf screamed when they realized what kind of situation they were in. "I probably should have started by telling them not to scream," Eugene muttered to himself as he let go of the elf's body. The elf, who had been switching between looking at Eugene and Christina from the moment they opened their eyes, started to crawl away from them backwards. The elf stammered. "Why you two, who are you? Tribals? Even though we've done all we can to save you, it seems like you don't feel the need to hold back with your rudeness," Eugene wryly observed. "I'm sorry. So sorry." The elf panically apologized. Although Eugene had only been complaining half-heartedly, the elf immediately started begging for forgiveness while knocking their head on the ground. After blatantly observing this sight, Christina glanced at Eugene. "It seems like your face and behavior have frightened them, Sir Eugene," Christina teased. "What about my face?" Eugene asked defensively. "It might not be as good as an elf's, but it's good enough that I don't feel ashamed taking it with me wherever I go." "Ahaha!" Christina burst out into laughter. Without lifting their bowed head, the elf clasped their hands and rubbed their palms together, as they said, "Yes, yes. The Lord's face is truly impressive. It's so amazing that no elf can even think of comparing to you." The madam is also extremely beautiful. Madam? Eugene repeated in confusion. I'm sorry. So sorry. The elf apologized once more. I meant the young lady is truly beautiful. What's wrong with them? Could their brain be a bit damaged as well? Eugene muttered to himself as he furrowed his brow. At this, the elves stopped rubbing their hands together and started banging their head against the ground as they said, "Eeh. That's right. Brain damage. My head isn't that good. So please, forgive me if I'm being foolish or fail to obey your orders." You try to calm them down a bit, Eugene said as he immediately stepped back behind Christina. At this, Christina just pointed at the basket packed full of wet laundry with a smile. Then she turned to the elf and said, "I've heard that your race is beautiful, and you seem to be living proof of that. My name is Christina. I am a priest who worships the god of light. The man over there drying the clothes is my servant and bodyguard, so please don't be too afraid of him." What the hell did she mean, servant? As Egwene grumbled to himself, he summoned up a spirit of the wind. The spirit began to dry the wet clothes. Christina continued to placate the elf. "We have no intentions of intimidating or harming you. Instead, we would actually like to protect you from any misfortune you might be in." The elf hesitated. "Are you really?" "Yes, of course, it's the truth. After all, it's only natural that the duty of a priest is to help and rescue those in trouble. And if there was a hero in this world, he too certainly wouldn't hesitate to do what is just and right." As Christina said this, she gave Eugene a glance. She had purposefully raised her voice so that he could hear her. Eugene just snorted as he casually folded the dried-out clothes. "And my name is Nerissa." The elf eventually introduced herself. Then she started to tell them such a tragic tale that it would bring tears to any listeners. To put it simply, Nerissa was a runaway slave. Her owner, a wealthy merchant in the Kiel Empire, had bought Nerissa on the black market 10 years ago. "And how old are you now?" Christina asked gently. Nerissa replied, "I'm 130. "If we convert that to human years, that means you're just 13, Eugene muttered. "Human years? What do you mean by that?" Christina asked as she turned to Eugene with a perplexed expression. Eugene explained, "The lifespan of an elf roughly extends to 1,000 years. Normal humans can live somewhere up to 100 years if they can manage a long life without any disease, so if you convert an elf lifespan into a human lifespan, every 100 years for them counts as 10 years for us. What kind of foolish nonsense is that?" Christina shook her head as she muttered this. The logic behind his claim seemed so absurd that it wasn't even funny, but Nerissa just clapped her hands in agreement with a servile smile as she said, "Weiss. In elf years I might be 130 years old, but in human years, I'm only 13. Eugene continued his interrogation. "So where is your hometown? Were you born in Samar?" "My hometown is in Kiel Empire's Mount Odin," Nerissa admitted. "Are there elves living there as well?" Eugene asked in surprise. Not anymore." After saying this, Nerissa's head sunk low, unable to find any more words. Eugene and Christina could figure out what had happened without even asking. It was rare for an elf to have been living in hiding deep within the mountains, but it wasn't rare for such an elf who lived in hiding to be captured and enslaved by a slaver. Christina sighed. How pitiful." After a long time, Christina finally showed the appearance of a real saint. She spread her arms and embraced Nerissa, stroking her trembling back. "It must have been so painful for you," Christina murmured sympathetically. "You had to cut off your own ankle just to escape, and then you came all the way to this forest." Eugene stepped past Christina as she continued to comfort Nerissa. Still stroking Nerissa's back, she glanced at Eugene but didn't say anything. She just nodded at him, causing Eugene to grin. Elves were a strong race. Unlike humans, they possessed an affinity with all spirits, and could sense mana even without any specific training. Their muscles were also far more flexible and durable than a human's. Hunters were always well informed about the races that they hunted, and only went hunting after making thorough preparations. This was the same for the tribespeople who lived in this forest. They were born as hunters and raised as hunters. An ordinary human being might not have been able to survive jumping from a tall cliff and landing in the river below. From such a height, landing on water was no different from landing on rock. If it was a human, they would have died, but an elf wouldn't have. It wasn't just because their bodies were stronger. Having an affinity to spirits literally meant being loved by those spirits. The main reason why elves could run so fast was that the spirits dispersed throughout the wind pushed them from behind. That also applied to this kind of fall. The wind and the river water would have protected the elf's body. Knowing that, the slavers hadn't stopped their pursuit of the elf. So you're from the Garung tribe? Eugene greeted the hunters from where he was sitting on a large rock. It had been a month since they had first entered the rainforest. They hadn't just been wandering around during all that time. They had also encountered a few merchants who were traversing the forest, and they had even met a few of the natives who belonged to different tribes. They weren't very pleasant meetings. The merchants mocked Christina's cover as a missionary, and the natives had tried to enslave the two foreigners who were traveling alone without an escort. All of them had immediately paid the price for acting like idiots. Through this process, Eugene had heard about the various tribes who lived in this forest. The deeper you went into the forest, the more savage and ferocious the natives became, especially in their ostracization of outsiders. The Garung were an example of one such tribe. They captured all foreigners and made them their tribe's slaves. If the foreigner they caught was a wealthy merchant or a noble who had come for a luxurious tour, they had a chance of being handed back over once the tribe received a large enough ransom. But even then, that was only if those who were captured got lucky. If they weren't lucky, they would just be killed and eaten. Some of the native tribes practiced cannibalism, and the Garung were one such tribe. "Outsider," spoke one of the natives riding on the backs of their large wolves. He had pulled up the mask on his face, making it obvious that he was staring at Eugene. The native's face was covered in scars and tattoos. "What doing here?" the native demanded. Unlike his vicious appearance, it seemed that he could speak the common language, but he enunciated the words slowly and in a slightly slurred manner. "What does it look like I'm doing?" Eugene replied. "I'm just sitting here and resting." The native continued his curt questioning. "A noble? From where? Who wants to know?" Eugene returned the question impudently. "This smell," the native said with a frown as he sniffed the air. Eugene chuckled and picked up a corner of his cloak to examine it. "Does it really give off such a smell?" "There's no reason why it should," Eugene argued. "I'm on the tidy side, so I wash my body every day." "It smells of elf," the native growled. "Do I look like an elf?" Eugene asked mockingly. "Outsider," the native said as it slipped his mask back down from where it had been propped up. "Garung's prey. Have you stolen it?" "What kind of prey comes with an owner?" "It's whoever catches it first that becomes its owner," Eugene said with a shrug as he dropped the corner of his cloak. The giant wolves charged at him.